Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by frequent guest of the show, Dr. Robert M. Price. And today we're going to be discussing Proto-Mark. Was there an earlier version of the Gospel of Mark? There are different scholars that hold different positions about that. Some believe that Matthew and Luke didn't even use the same version of Mark, but used two different Proto-Marks copied from the original Proto-Mark, like take Delbert Burkett, for example. That's what he thinks. And there are other scholars that will say that the Gospel of Marcion is first, but even the Gospel of Marcion used an earlier form of Mark that we don't have. That scholars like that think that include those like Mark Bilby that believes that Proto-Mark was used by the Gospel of Marcion. As a matter of fact, Mark Bilby will be joining the show later this month. But anyway, welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Price.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. So let's just start with this. What are your personal thoughts on Proto-Mark?
Well, I'm like an old mossback, stubbornly adhering to the paradigm that seems to me to work best. It gets the most interesting results, and that is that Matthew and Luke independently used both Mark and the Q document, whatever it was. And I assume, but I'll repeat that. Most people probably are aware Q. It's I think it was Christian Wiss, a German scholar, proposed this paradigm, and he called the unknown second source in common common to Luke and Matthew, Q, because of the German word Quelle. Quelle, which just means source, and so it was like the saying source. Sometimes people expanded it slightly to mean that, and it would have been a kind of a book of Proverbs attributed to Jesus, whether originally or subsequently. It could be a Christianized text. And this gets into all kinds of fascinating questions that are kind of beside the point here, but such as can we discern three different versions of Q or three different strata of Q? That it's because you can distinguish subject-wise between what looks like an early collection of sayings in 7 distinct categories, and all of them are reminiscent of the distinctives of the Cynic philosophical movement. And so Burton Mack and others argued for this, and they said that more dogmatic, eschatological end of the world, right, and Christological elements were added later in a couple of stages as Christians used the saying source by itself, and there are all kinds of other implications. If this was some Christian group's sole gospel at some point, then does that mean that such a group did not view Jesus as bearing any of these familiar titles like Son of God and the Messiah and all that, because they don't appear in Q? The Son of Man does, but that can mean a whole lot of things. And so it became more and more Christian. But this issue of Mark's role in the whole mix simply assumes that, Mark, well, actually, it's so complicated. Q would be all the stuff that Matthew and Luke share in common that they did not get from Mark, but they used Mark and some other source, the Q source as we call it, and so that you can see trends of editorial changes. For instance, boy, this piece of Matthew sure looks an awful lot like the corresponding section in Mark, but there are some interesting additions or omissions. At least the differences look kind of like that's why they differ, but I'm not so sure I like this. For instance, Mark and Luke in the debate about divorce, Jesus says if anyone puts away his wife and then marries another, he's committing adultery and forcing her to, since she kind of has to remarry given the times. But in Matthew, so that seems like a big no. You can't get divorced because you're inviting adultery and so forth. But in Matthew, it reads almost the same way, but it says that anyone who puts away his wife for any cause epi me porneia, I guess it's me epi porneia, except for what's porneia? Some sort of immorality. Usually people think it here denotes adultery, but there's a separate Greek word for that, moichia. Porneia used to mean simply prostitution, but it had been widened in scope and meant some kind of illicit sexual behavior. And Matthew has added that to make it clear that, well, there are pretexts for this. There are legitimate reasons for it after all. Well, what's the deal there? Did Jesus say it and Mark just forgot that part of it, but Matthew didn't? Doesn't seem like it. It would make more sense if you said Luke has copied Mark accurately. Matthew has, except that he has amended it in light of practical difficulties in his church community. That people would like to stick with the rigorous standard of Jesus found in Mark, but oh boy, we've had these scandals come up. Are we really going to tell wives whose husbands have betrayed them that they have to stick with the jerk anyway? I can't see that. I mean, this is sort of maybe an exception to the rule. Did Jesus really have in mind that even in a case like that, can't get divorced, sorry, tough luck, live with it, get over it? And I can't believe that. So he added, except for porneia. Just like some scribe with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount added the phrase with the qualifier without cause to the Jesus saying, whoever is angry at his brother has already committed murder in his heart. What, you can't get angry? I mean, isn't there such a thing as righteous indignation? Jesus certainly is pictured as getting pretty steamed at some of his opponents. I bet he meant it in a more focused way. So some scribe added to his copy, whoever is angry with his brother without cause is guilty, of murder, at least figuratively. So it's easy to envision that kind of editorial change, and I think that's how you can explain the differences. It looks like Matthew has changed some of Mark or Q. It's really the same issue. And in one way, and Luke will have left that one alone, but found reason to make some other change. Not to mention adding material that's not in either Mark or Q, that they don't have in common either. And scholars like to say, well, of course, that's the M material that Matthew got from another source or whatever, and the L material, that which is unique to Luke. Keep that in mind, because, occasionally you will have Matthew and Luke both making the same change to Mark, or let's put it another way, differing from Mark's text in the same way between the two of them. And that has, and other things, but that's the biggie, I think, that has led many scholars more and more all the time to say, I think we could solve this whole thing about who used whom by eliminating Q and saying that either, boy, I tell you, this gets confusing, but I think if you really stick with it, it'll make sense. Instead of Q being in the situation, instead of there even having been such a thing, we don't have any copies of it, maybe we should say that Luke used Mark and that Matthew then encountered both books and decided, gee, this is good stuff. I think I will do, in effect, a new version of Mark incorporating some of this nifty L material, this extra stuff Luke has. But sometimes, however, he didn't want to go for the Lucan modification and left Mark alone, or preferred his own addition or editorial change. Well, I got to, or you could flip it around and say maybe Matthew used Mark, and then Luke discovered both Matthew and Mark and used both of them in just the same way. I see Mark and Matthew overlap here. To tell you the truth, I kind of prefer Matthew's version on this, so I think I'm going to adopt that one. Or maybe, I'm not so sure about what Matthew did here. I think I'm going to stick to Mark. There's nothing implausible about that. That would make sense. But I do have a problem with it. It seems to me that you can explain a couple of things more naturally if you say that Luke and Matthew used Mark, and that's the total differences between the nativity stories on one end of Matthew and Luke and the resurrection stories on the other end. Like, why would you say that Matthew found fault with Luke's nativity story? Seems to have the same sort of interests in mind. Why would you think Luke found something to complain about in Matthew so that he had to just chop the whole darn thing and add a new one? I don't see any reason for that. It just doesn't make sense to me. And even worse, how about the resurrection stories? Well, it's mighty interesting that Mark doesn't have any, right? He sort of anticipates that Jesus is inviting the 12 to meet him at a reunion in Galilee, but they never get the message because the women that the angel or whoever told to convey this invitation to the disciples were so freaked out by the vision of the angel that they said, look, I'm not getting involved in this. And so they said nothing to anyone, Mark says at the end of his gospel, and because they were terrified. Okay, so no resurrection appearances in Mark. Now, why is that? Did the last page get torn off? It's possible. It seems a little unlikely, though, somehow. But for whatever reason, isn't it interesting that Matthew uses Mark's empty tomb story as a diving board, and he has a brief subsequent ending where the disciples do get the message from the women and do go to Galilee and meet Jesus, and he gives them the Great Commission, the evangelistic command, right? And then he says, I'll be with you always, even till the end of the age, and so on. But in Luke, again, he uses the empty tomb story of Mark as a launching pad for a more extensive set of resurrection appearances, that none of which happen in Galilee. They all happen in and around Jerusalem. And it's different in various ways. Instead of there being one young man, there's two. In Matthew, it's not just a young man; it's a young man, and then Jesus. Like it. Why would this be? Well, to me, the best way to understand that is that Matthew and Luke were independently using Mark. And they thought, this seems kind of truncated. There's not much of a beginning. It starts with Jesus coming to a sort of an evangelistic rally, from John the Baptist Evangelistic Association, and he gets baptized, and then the Holy Spirit falls on him. What could he have been doing earlier? I mean, in fact, that instinct of curiosity in subsequent centuries would lead to the composition of unwittingly hilarious infancy gospels, where Jesus is a young kid and starts blasting his playmates who bump into him on the playground and stuff like this. I don't think they thought it was funny, but it is. So people just couldn't get enough, and they couldn't leave these blank spots. And on the other end, Matthew and Luke are coming, oh boy, can't wait to see what happens after the empty tomb. Nothing. What? How can that be? Well, it's interesting that there are early copies of Mark, but not the earliest, that supply endings, longer or shorter. There's a couple of them. And it was like they thought, this can't be a proper ending. It's too abrupt. Well, Matthew and Luke apparently thought the same thing. And so they said, let me supply some of these resurrection appearances. What would Jesus have said as his parting instructions? I bet it must have been this or that. And so they wrote them. I just don't see how the version where Matthew chopped Luke's nativity and resurrection appearances, or that Luke chopped Matthew's. Why? And so it seems to me all of them make more sense if you say Matthew and Luke used Mark. But the question remains, how come they agree against Mark in their alterations occasionally? Well, one of the biggies, I think the biggest one, would be Jesus' reply to the high priest at the Sanhedrin trial, when they ask him, okay, enough of this, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And in Mark, as we have it in most manuscripts, Jesus says, I am. But in Matthew and Luke, he says, you say that I am. Huh? What does that mean exactly? I mean, it certainly sounds equivocal. If you say so. Well, no. What do you think? Now, apologists will say, don't worry. That was a common form of decisive affirmation in first century Greek or Aramaic. I don't buy that. I think they're being a little too easy on themselves. If they were right, that would mean that all three versions really mean the same thing, but I don't think they do. So I think, and this is like a paradigm case, I think the other ones can be explained this way too. I think that as some few manuscripts read, very early ones, Jesus said in Mark, you say so. And that some scribe who had only Mark to copy said, that can't be. Jesus is being evasive about his messianic self-declaration. That's got to be a mistake. And so he made what the footnotes in the Revised Standard Version called a conjectural emendation. Yeah, it must have said this. And so he changed the you say so to I am. Now, Matthew and Luke were copying from Mark, but they must have not seen the manuscripts that had the original, I'm sorry, they must not have seen the altered manuscript where Jesus makes a forthright declaration, I am. They must have been working from copies of Mark that had the original equivocation. You say that I am. And that opens up the door to saying, was there an earlier version of Mark than the one we have? And if so, are other changes or are other differences a result of editorial changes that one evangelist picked up that the other didn't? And so if there was an earlier version of Mark that not only lacked any nativity or any resurrection appearances, it may have differed in a number of ways. And there, who knows that if copyists were making new versions of Mark, either by intentional editing or just by goofs. It certainly happens a lot when you're transcribing something. It's not difficult to imagine that Matthew and Luke, they had copies of an earlier version of Mark that weren't the earliest, that already had copyist changes in them. And there's the theory that Jacob mentioned that there were two different proto-marks. Then again, you'd have to.
I want to expand on that just for a moment before you continue.
Please.
So basically, this comes from I'm not exactly sure if he's the very first person to articulate it in this way, but I know that there was something, or there was a theory somewhat like it that's earlier, but I don't know the specifics right now. But anyway. Professor Delbert Burkett believes that Matthew used Proto-Mark A, which contains the Matthean-Markan agreements, whereas Proto-Mark B contains the Markan-Lucan agreements, and both Proto-Mark A and B copied from a text he just labels simply Proto-Mark, and he thinks that canonical Mark combines the material in Proto-Mark A and Proto-Mark B.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks, therefore, that canonical Mark, canonical Matthew, and canonical Luke are completely independent of one another, all using sources.
This is also relevant to the question of both the first epistle of John and the Gospel of John, both of which are teeming with confusing contradictions. Like in the Gospel of John, Jesus can say things like, I and the Father are one. Or, Philip, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. What is happening there? I mean, because it also has Jesus seemingly deny that he's claiming to be equal with God, right? He says, hey, you guys, hold those rocks there. I've done a lot of good things among you. Which one of those you think merits capital punishment? I said, it's not for any good thing you did, you blasphemer. It's because you're making yourself equal with God. I think that's because he said, my Father is working still, and so I'm working on the Sabbath. What? You compare yourself with God? Well, what's Jesus' reaction? He says, well, what about that psalm where it says, I said you are gods? Let's see. Okay. So he says, now, if Scripture says to those who receive the word of God that they're gods, how can you blame me? I didn't even say that. I just said I'm the Son of God. Now, that sounds to me like a denial of the so-called deity of Christ doctrine. Or how about the one I mentioned a moment ago? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. The next word is, or don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? What are you talking about? What does that mean? Well, it doesn't really mean anything except feel free to disregard the previous verse. I'm not quite sure what this means, but I'm suggesting it's more ambiguous. So don't get in a huff. And because the text was too well established, and they couldn't just strike it out. They figured they'd get in trouble. Somebody reading it saying, "Hey, what the heck's this? Who made this copy? Gaius over there? You're out of the church." So that you got these contradictions, or it's almost worse in First John, right, where whoever is born of God does not sin because he cannot sin. Oh, whenever you sin, just remember that God is ready and willing to forgive you. Wait, can you sin or can't you? What's up? Well, one thing First John tells us is that there was a schism in the Johannine community, and it had to do with Christology and apparently with practice, what we call libertinism. Saved by grace, so blessed thought. Sin as I will and never get caught. Jesus paid it all, so it's a blind check for sin.
If we could pause just right there just for a moment. Yep. We got a super chat question I'd like to get to. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. What evidence is there of the Zohar and Kabbalah in the First Temple period?
As far as I know, you have, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls and probably in 2 Corinthians, the idea of Merkavah mysticism. The Merkavah was the divine throne chariot that Ezekiel supposedly saw by the river in Babylon. And it's a very strange and fascinating passage, I think in chapter 1, where he sees this throne like a king's chariot. It's a throne inside a chariot. And he would ride it onto the battlefield, maybe throw a spear or shoot an arrow or something. And this one was drawn by these weird cherubim, these entities with 4 faces, like Brahma in Hinduism, the faces of an eagle, an ox, a lion, and a human man. And they have wings that rotate, and there are wheels underneath the thing, and it's so weird. One author who worked for NASA said, I hate to say it, but this sounds like a viable landing pod from a flying saucer. Maybe it was. Well, I don't dismiss the guy as a nut. I don't think he was, but my big qualm about that was you couldn't possibly have remembered such a complex thing in such detail. I think what this was originally Ezekiel's blueprint for a new Ark of the Covenant to replace the one stolen by Shishak or Nebuchadnezzar or one of these guys that looted the temple. And he, just like he has an unbelievably minute description or blueprint for a rebuilt temple later in the book. So that's what I think was going on. But nonetheless, these people, these ancient mystics said that, Ezekiel was actually seeing the throne of God as it exists in heaven. If you could ascend to heaven, you would see it there. Well, in like the 1st and 2nd century, or even earlier with the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are descriptions of such visionary journeys to heaven, where the visionary sees the throne chariot of God, and it warns you, you got to prepare for this carefully because it may be too much for you, especially if you're not as worthy as you think you are. And there was a great story called The Four Who Entered Paradise, which is a cautionary tale. And it says 4 eminent rabbis got together to meditate in a circle so that they might have Ezekiel's journey to heaven repeated. They wanted to see what he saw. Well, it succeeded, says the story, but it didn't have a happy ending for everybody. One of the rabbis went stark raving mad at the sight. It was just too mind-blowing. Another one keeled over dead. You know why, right? Man shall not see me and live. Another one retained his sanity, but couldn't understand what he saw. And he saw the angel Metatron sitting at the right hand of God, and he said, "There are two powers in heaven." And when he came down to earth from the vision, he began teaching that heresy. It was only, I think, Rabbi Akiva, who, I think I got the right rabbi there, who came out of it orthodox and sane and alive. And the idea was, don't fool around with this stuff. And what does Paul say in 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 10? He ascended to the third heaven, where he saw the Lord, but he was so elated and swell-headed that an angel from Satan, that's what it says, angelos, Satani or whatever it is, that God decided to take me down a peg by sending this angel to beat me. Actually, is the word, I think it's kolafizo, to beat with the fist. And he said, well, that's how I learned henceforth to rejoice in my sufferings and my weakness, because it's at the very point when I'm at the end of my rope that the power of God is manifest. I get out of the way with my delusions of my worthiness and my ability, and that clears the ground for God's almighty power to shine through. It's a fascinating story with a real point to it, but it sounds like Merkava mysticism because of the threat of being assaulted by angels if you are unworthy and all that. And again, the Dead Sea Scrolls mention it. The weirdest Christian treatment of this I ever read was in Bruce Chilton's book, Jesus and an Informal Biography, or a Rabbi Jesus, I think. I read so many books with similar titles, I've forgotten. But he says that the thing that kept Jesus going through his ministry in all his trials and tribulations was his vision of the heavenly throne chariot of God that he had when he was baptized by John in the Jordan. I thought, where's he getting this? Is there another gospel I've never read? It's a very weird book. It's really almost on the level of Bill O'Reilly's novel, Killing Jesus. It's pseudo-historical. But anyhow, there is evidence that this kind of mysticism dates back into at least like the 2nd century BCE. As to the stuff you find in the Zohar, I'm not sure that really does go back that far. The whole encyclopedic book is credited to, I believe it's Simeon Bar Yochai, is that right? No, wait a minute. Oh boy, I'm forgetting it, who would have lived in the 2nd century CE, but all evidence really points to it having been written in the 13th century by Moses de Leon, a Kabbalist in Spain. That's not the beginning of the Kabbalah, but it's kind of the definitive form. And so that seems to date from later on. The lore of creation, that's yet another branch of it. That seems to be earlier. That comes out of a book called the Sefer, or Book of Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. And that retains an important place in the Kabbalah for a long time, but I cannot recall when that was supposedly written, or how old the traditions are that it uses. Fascinating stuff, that's for sure.
We have another super chat. Constellation Pegasus again. Thank you for your super chat. He says, interesting. Kabbalah says if you say the names of angels, they'll make you go crazy.
Whoa. Yeah, that's like a great sanction for keeping it secret, like the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, the members of the sect, who I tend to think were the early Jewish Christians, but they had lists of the secret names of angels that they had to learn and memorize. Why would that have been? Well, I think it's because, like the Gnostics, and they sort of had a foot in Gnosticism, they believed that upon death, your soul would go up through the various heavens, and to ascend all the way to get into the paradise of God, you would have to know the password, because the various angels who were not a friendly crew would try to stop you and make you go back down and perhaps be reincarnated. Better luck next time, sucker. And that's, I'm guessing that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls sect had these names. And they were secret because you didn't want them falling into the wrong hands, the hands of the unworthy. And again, think of the rabbi with the four who entered paradise, who the one who went crazy because he did succeed in seeing the throne chariot, though he'd have been better off if he hadn't, since he must not have been ready for it. And this must be somehow the same sort of thing. There's certain things that are secret for a reason, and you better leave them unsaid. This reminds me also of one other thing. A medieval mutation of the idea of the demiurge, the creator, the craftsman. The Gnostics borrowed it from Plato. This came to be this weird legend that if anyone ever pronounced that name in its form of Demogorgon, though that you can see that's like a kind of slurred demiurge, demiurgos. If anybody pronounced it out loud, as I just did, the world itself would come to an end. I find it a little hard to believe that no one ever yielded to that temptation, but if they did, the little experiment to prove that they were wrong. But I don't know enough about that. You taught me something I didn't know. That's fascinating.
All right. So, until we get some more super chats, let's get back to Proto-Mark. So, do you think that Matthew and Luke, just tell me what you lean towards. Do you think Matthew and Luke didn't use the same version of Mark, or do you think they modified the same copy of Mark but differently?
Well, I used to think that, oh yeah, they were using the same version of Mark, and I explained these occasional occasional Matthew Luke agreements against Mark as copyist assimilation. Like we know there was a tendency of scholars to unwittingly assimilate one gospel to another because they knew them very well, having made loads of copies of them. And when they got to a certain point, they thought they remembered what came next, but they didn't, and inadvertently wrote what was in another gospel at that point. I say we know they did that sometimes because that's the only way to explain why Matthew and Luke differ about the Lord's Prayer. For one thing, Matthew's is longer and more poetic, well, yeah, okay, let's leave it at that. Luke is shorter, more compact, but as you go later and later in the textual tradition, later and later manuscript copies, the two versions of the Lord's Prayer start looking more and more alike until finally, in the latest copies, it just reads like Matthew's, with the sole exception that it has debts instead of trespasses. Why they didn't notice that, I don't know, but you can tell that's what happened. And it had to be that. They thought they were copying the right thing, but they just went on automatic pilot, and people still do that. And so it seemed to me we could probably explain every one of these minor or major agreements against Mark that way. And that might be good enough, but I really do kind of like this Proto-Mark A and Proto-Mark B. That's an even better explanation, because it's very easy to imagine that before Matthew and Luke got a hold of any version of Mark, that Mark had already suffered alterations in the process of copying. Different ones from different scribes, and so they're using two different proto-marks, not hugely different. But in my conjectural reconstruction of Proto-Mark, which is admittedly totally speculative, I just sort of did it for the fun of it. I believe I posted it on my Patreon, and I know it was printed in the Christian New Age Quarterly. I suggest there that something like this that goes back, I think, to B.F. Streeter in his great book on the synoptic problem, called The Synoptic Problem, I think. No, the Four Gospels, wasn't it? In it, he says that,
Yeah, that's right. The Four Gospels.
Yeah, okay. I'm not totally gone. He points out, I think it's Streeter, who points out how Luke is missing a series of miracles that you find in Mark chapter 7. I was talking about this, I think, last night. What's his name? I'll come up with it later. The scholar pointed, he called them miracle catenae, or chains. And he said, it looks like that this series of 4 or 5 gospel miracle stories in Mark 5 are so close to a similar sequence in Mark 7. Both have food multiplication miracles, both have sea miracles, both have exorcisms, etc. And then somebody pointed out that, well, really, the so-called signs source in the Gospel of John has another version of the same thing, slightly different wording, but so similar. You sort of have to think they're 3 variant versions. Well, Luke doesn't have it. Now, Matthew does. He just repeats it from Mark. But why doesn't Luke have it? Well, Luke is a long gospel. It would make sense if he just noticed how similar the 2 miracle chains were and decided, I'm not going to have room for all the new stuff I want to add. This version seems kind of superfluous if you've got the other one. I'm going to need the room. I think I'll just omit the one version that Mark had. And scholars call this the great omission. Well, I thought, well, that could be, but I kind of like the rival theory that the one version that Luke lacks wasn't in the version of Mark that he used. And that would mean you've got 2 different Mark sources, depending on whether you're studying Matthew or Luke. So I was already sort of leaning in that direction.
By the way, I just want to butt in to say this.
Well,
On
please,
the screen, this is the diagram of the 4 document hypothesis based on B.H. Streeter. His literary dependency analysis is, so he's got Matthew and Luke using Mark, Luke using Proto-Luke, and Proto-Luke and Matthew using Q, and Proto-Luke using L. So Luke's not directly using Q or L, but he's using Proto-Luke, which is the intermediary source for Luke to get his information from those 2 sources. And then the document of infancy, from what I remember, I think that's supposed to explain Luke's infancy narrative.
Yeah, that would be part of the
Yeah.
L material. And that, in fact, reminds me of another point I wanted to make. I know this doesn't ultimately matter. It's not much of a thumb on the scale, but it occurred to me that possibly the what people don't like about this paradigm with uh, Q in it is that it's a kind of canon anxiety that that some are theologically uncomfortable with the idea that we lost a gospel somewhere along the way. And the same way that in the early church, somebody concocted an epistle to the Laodiceans, since Colossians mentions one, but we don't have it. Oh no, we're missing a Pauline epistle. Well, not for long. And one guy wrote a 29th chapter of Acts and claimed he had discovered it. There's like an attempt to fill in the vacuum. Well, I think that William Farmer and others were uneasy with this and said, hey, you wouldn't have to suggest there was a lost gospel Q if you had, one of these other theories. You could just explain synoptic relations with
Will Farmer thought the Grisback hypothesis explains the data better.
So that's like Mark is an abbreviated combination of Matthew and Luke, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Richard Arthur, a colleague of mine at the Jesus Seminar, was convinced that's true. But I have big problems with that. Why would you omit not only the resurrection accounts, the nativity, but the Sermon on the Mount, for Pete's sake? Right? I guess you could say Mark was sort of a dimwit and he just didn't know how to choose where he would have to have chosen one. Whose nativity story am I going to use? Whose resurrection accounts am I going to use? Oh, I don't know, a flip a coin. I'll just cut both of them out. That seems so stupid and blockheaded to me. I just can't countenance that one. But I think I always wondered if Farmer was motivated by canon anxiety. But if he was, or if anybody is, that doesn't disprove what they're saying, right? It's just my mind reading attempt. And I think it's futile because if you've gotten rid of Q, you still have hypothetical vanished sources in M and L. Now, there are ways around that, I realize, but you've still got to say, well, if Matthew used Mark and Luke, where did he get the M material? If Luke used Matthew and Mark, where did he get the L material? You're just playing a shell game. You're stuck with an unknown and non-extant extra source any way you cut it, unless you go with this thing with Proto-Mark or Proto-Marks, both used along with Q. And some have said there probably were different versions of Q, which also makes sense for the same reason. Or that Q was an oral, memorized set of sayings. So I find that a little hard to believe. But it could be. So a lot of these things remain possible. And it's not just a moot question, like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and that kind of thing, because this does have big implications for redaction criticism, because depending on what changes you think who made in what, you have a different teaching emerging in the alteration of the passages. And like, what was Matthew adding to Luke? What was he modifying? What different point was he making? But if Luke used Matthew, it has a different light cast on it, and so forth. So I don't know that this will ever be solved unless somebody actually discovers manuscript copies. And boy, I hope I lived long enough to see that.
So we'll see what slide 3 looks like in a little bit. But in the meantime, we do have a super chat question. Brave New History, thank you for your super chat. Was the King Abgar legend responding to Mark?
I connect that with John. I'm not sure what you have in mind, because obviously you do have a link in mind that I'd like to hear more about. But my theory is that some form of this legend, and not saying it's based on fact, who knows, but some form of this story, I suspect, lies behind a kind of a narrative blank in the Gospel of John. Jesus says at some point, "Where I am going, you cannot follow," and it says that that certain Greeks came up to Andrew, I think, and said, "Sir, we would see Jesus. Can you introduce us?" I guess that's first, and then he says to the critics that I'm leaving and you can't follow, and they say, "What does it mean by that? Is he going to go out into the Jewish diaspora and teach the Greeks?" Well, John, I think, tends to float views that he wants to refute by putting them in the mouths of either the dim-wit disciples or the thick-headed opponents of Jesus. They're both always misunderstanding him. What's he saying? How can he give us his flesh to eat? What's this, cannibalism? And so on. Well, I have a sneaking hunch that what happened here is that originally Andrew or Philip or Sylvester, whoever, one of the disciples, did bring the Greeks to Jesus. And they were Greeks in a looser sense. They were from Edessa, and brought this communique from King Abgar, who said, "I know what's going on over there. You're a healer. You do great deeds. Well, I'm sick. I could use your healing. And I hear that some people are after you. Why don't you come take refuge with me? You'll be safe here." And Jesus says, "Well, thanks, but no thanks. I can't. I have a predestined mission, but I will send somebody." I mean, he's sending disciples out to heal people elsewhere in the Gospels, right? That's not particularly apocryphal sounding. But maybe in this version, he said he would, and that he's telling that to the critics. So, "Well, I'm about to leave, and you'll never find me." And they say, "What, is he going to go among the Greeks and teach the Greeks?" Yeah, I'm guessing that was the original version of the story, and that he left. And that this would explain some of these ideas that Jesus was seen in India or Rome or whatever. There's a lot of strange stuff going on in the early church and in early Christian documents. And I suspect that is so tempting to say that Eusebius's letters between Abgarus and Jesus would fit right there in that hole. The embassy of Greeks who want to see Jesus for some reason, and the hint that he may be going out into the Hellenistic world to have a mission there to escape his enemies. Though John didn't like that, which is why we don't read it now. This is pure speculation. I know, or I'm not going to bet the farm on it.
Okay, we have a super chat question. Kevin Hogan, thank you for your super chat. Oregon slams Celsus for referencing Jesus as a simple prophet, no virgin, resurrection, salvation. This is possibly what Mark had access to and provides evidence to why his gospel needed redaction after redaction.
Well, any way you cut it, it's something like that. I mean, I'm surprised. I read Contra Kelson, but it was years ago. I forget everything Kelsa says he derived from Jewish opponents of Christianity. I know he also said that Jesus was a magician, which of course Mark kind of agrees with, right? How does he heal people? He spits on their tongue, he puts mud on their eyes, he sticks his fingers in their ears as if they were stopped up and opens them. These were magicians' techniques. Magician, faith healer, whatever you want to call them. That was all the same in the ancient world. And so that fit. I mean, there was basis for that. There's even a glass bowl with a gold paint on it from the early church, where Jesus is depicted as raising Lazarus using a magic wand. Sheesh. So yeah, I mean, Mark does kind of look more like Origen's view. And that wouldn't be surprising. And whether he got it from Kelsis' view, whether he got it from Kelsis somehow, I don't know. I don't know if we can ever be sure of that. But your point is made anyway, because it's these features of Mark that seem to be more modest than in Matthew, Luke, and John, including his using magic techniques and not simply divine power. And no virgin birth, no resurrection appearances. We certainly know that the lack of those things motivated the other evangelists to supplement Mark and add to it. So whether, the role of Celsus, I don't know, but could be. The central point is, I think, certainly justified.
Dafa Raffaelli, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you for the super chat. Did Jesus claim to be God? What is the most reasonable answer? What top scholars said about it? Also, what the consensus answer about it?
I get the impression that conservative scholars like N.T. Wright and William Lane Craig and people like this, and I want to be careful about this, these people are quite learned. They do merit being called scholars. I never deny that. They're not some sort of fakes, right? But their motive is the defense of the faith. And so it seems to me that they always slant the evidence in a predetermined direction. Now, even that doesn't ultimately matter, because whether you agree with them or not, you have to evaluate their arguments based on the apparent strength of the logic and the evidence and so forth. So I want to make clear who I'm talking about and why. But it's no accident that conservatives tend to say, yeah, Jesus did say, or at least strongly imply, that he was God on earth in some capacity. I think that the more critical the scholar, because now there are people that were raised in the evangelical churches, but then got graduate study in more critical institutions, and they realize it's not so simple. But they're what James Barr called maximal conservatives. They come out with the position that is closest to the traditional dogmatic one, if they can. And again, that kind of involves what they don't recognize as special pleading. But I think that's why conservative scholars would say, well, Jesus did claim to be God, or darn near it. Like C.S. Lewis, who was no New Testament scholar and didn't claim to be one, he says that Jesus did claim to be God, and so forthrightly that we have only three choices, Either he was a lying charlatan, and there were such people in the ancient world, there sure are today, or a raving madman, like a guy who thinks he's Napoleon, or what he claimed to be, God. Well, so naturally, Lewis thought, yeah, he claimed to be God. I'm not sure some of our maximal conservatives would go that far, but they'll start using other ones like, well, maybe he was sort of hinting he was God. Like, I know I've heard this one, read this one. Jesus assumes the authority to repeal the commandments of the Torah. Now, who could do that but God? Well, of course, it could just be somebody that thought they had been tasked by God to introduce a new legal dispensation. He doesn't seem to have thought of that one. But in fact, if you look close, he's not repealing any of those commandments. Does Jesus say, you've heard it was said to the men of old, you shall not murder, but I say to you, it's open season on murder. It's like the purge. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, so what? Go ahead. Be Hugh Hefner. We don't care. He doesn't say things like that. He says, you've heard it was said, you must keep the vows you make. But I say, why bother? Don't make vows at all. Be the kind of person whose word no one will doubt. Hey, you've heard people say, hey, look, you don't have to promise. You don't have to sign a contract. I know you. I know you'll follow through. He says, anything more than that comes from the evil one, which is a shrewd insight, right? I mean, if you have to say, no, really, I'm swearing, I'm giving my word. You mean if you didn't put that qualifier on it, I shouldn't trust you? Well, I guess that is kind of what he means. That's kind of stupid. But Jesus doesn't, in fact, like the Sabbath. Oh, you're breaking the Sabbath. Jesus always gives a scriptural argument saying, no, look what David did in a similar situation on the Sabbath. He fed his men who were starving. Or I healed this guy who was paralyzed on the Sabbath. Well, you allow a baby boy to be circumcised on the Sabbath. That's work, if you want to call it that, if the eighth day happens to fall on it. And so he's giving counter arguments from Scripture. So this is based on a gross and obvious misunderstanding of the text. Or how about when Jesus says to the rich young ruler, why do you call me good? There's only one who's good. That's God. Oh, well, Jesus is saying, you're right, buddy. I am good because I'm God. Don't you realize that? You don't really seem to know who you're talking to here. I can only say that this is the most miserable case of text twisting. I mean, it seems obvious to me that Jesus is being shown as a man with the humility due a human being, right? That no flesh should boast in the sight of God, right? He's maybe he is also God incarnate. It doesn't really raise that issue, but maybe he's just saying, as a human like you, I don't know that I would merit that flattery. Who knows? But it doesn't. It's just the wildest, far-fetched way of reading that passage. It seems to me. You'd never think it meant that if you weren't looking desperately under every rock for somewhere where Jesus claims to be God. Now, I have already said, I think in the Gospel of John, he does. Right? Lord, show us the Father, and that'll suffice. Have I been with you this long, Philip, and you still don't recognize me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. That's what the early church called patripassianism. Jesus is God the Father. there are conflicting accounts because we don't know what, if any, of this stuff Jesus actually said. Lewis was being a fundamentalist. I mean, he wasn't in many respects, but he was just a kind of naive literalist. He he said that, oh, this looks like front page reporting to me. It's just like the famous biography of Samuel Johnson by his secretary Boswell. That's the only parallel I can see to this kind of on the spot reporting. Well, he was even wrong about Boswell's Johnson. That's been recognized as fictionalized, but Lewis didn't know that. It just seems to me that the clear affirmations seem, which are confined to John, are partly for that reason to be attributed to John. They're not evidence for what the historical Jesus might have said. I mean, there have been people that claim to be God. It's not like it's impossible to imagine that someone would. And contra Lewis, they wouldn't have to be crazy if they did. There are various Hindu saints who believed themselves to be divine avatars, and they weren't necessarily a bunch of kooks or anything. So anyway, more mainstream scholars like Bart Ehrman will say, no, he didn't ever make such a claim. Others made it for him because they just thought the world of Jesus or the story of Jesus and figured a guy that can do the things he is said to have done, he must be divine. So they put two and two together. Whether they got four or five, I don't know.
All right, let's go back to the diagrams. So this is the multi-source hypothesis based on Dr. Delbert Royce Burkett's work. So you got Proto-Mark all the way on the top there, which is being used in Proto-Mark A and B. And C, the C document, is a hypothetical document that I don't think I've ever talked about on the show before, is something that is used by Proto-Mark A, B, Matthew, and Luke. Texts that he thinks are there in all four of those documents.
Yeah, now, that sounds very good to me.
You see in the center there, you got K, the K document, which is supposed to contain the unique material in Mark, not in Matthew and Luke.
Huh. So it's more likely that Matthew and Luke just did not have the stories of the healing of the blind man at Bethany and the deaf mute and the young man fleeing naked in the garden.
Actually, I think it'd be easier if I just read a little sample from an introduction to the New Testament and the Origins of Christianity by Delbert Burkett. And here's what he says. He says, if none of the synoptics we now possess served as the source for the other two, then they must have used some source or sources now lost. Perhaps all three gospels descended from a primitive gospel that we could call Proto-Mark, meaning a version of Mark that was earlier and shorter than the one we have now. Let us suppose that this gospel circulated in various places where it underwent revision. In one place, I will call location A, the church had traditions about Jesus that they wanted to incorporate into Proto-Mark. In addition, let me read that. In adding these traditions, they created a revision of Proto-Mark I will call Proto-Mark A. In location B, these two revisions then began to circulate. Matthew used Proto-Mark A, Luke used Proto-Mark B, and Mark used them both. So far, our theory looks like this. Proto-Mark, we're just using Proto-Mark A and Proto-Mark B. I'm looking at the diagram that he has in the book and reading it like that. He has Proto-Mark and Proto-Mark A and Proto-Mark B using Proto-Mark, and then on the bottom he has Matthew, Mark, and Luke using Proto-Mark A and Proto-Mark B, but not each other. Which The diagram I created here is an imitation of the diagram in the book. To visualize what he's talking about here.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
And then he says, this part of the theory would account for several features of the synoptic material. The synoptic core would be material from Proto-Mark that descended through the 2 revisions to all 3 synoptics with no change of order. The Mark-Matthew material would be material in Proto-Mark A, used by Mark and Matthew. The Mark-Luke material would be material in Proto-Mark B, used by Mark and Luke. He goes on to say that to complete our theory, we will borrow several elements from the 2-document hypothesis. Q to account for the Matthew-Luke material, M to account for material unique to Matthew, and L to account for material unique to Luke. Finally, we will throw in K to account for the material unique to Mark, hence the K document in the diagram here. This theory could be considered a modified form of the 2-document hypothesis, since it postulates a Q source to account for the Matthew-Luke material and a second source, Proto-Mark, to account for the material common to all 3 Gospels. Its superiority to the 2-document hypothesis lies in the fact that it avoids all the problems involved in the theory of Markan priority. Number 1, it can account for the minor agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark. These would have occurred where Mark made redactional changes to the Proto-Markan tradition, while Matthew and Luke kept it unchanged. 2, it can account for the material and stylistic features unique to Mark. These came from K and from Mark's revision, and hence were unknown to Matthew and Luke. 3, it can account for the evidence that Mark conflated and redacted earlier traditions known respectively to Matthew, Proto-Mark A, and Luke, Proto-Mark B. At the same time, it avoids one of the main objections of the Griesbach hypothesis, the problems presented by the view that Mark that drew directly on Matthew and Luke.
Fascinating, really. That makes a lot of sense.
And to reiterate, this is from Delbert Burkett's An Introduction to the. Let me read that. Let me reread that. An Introduction to the New Testament and the Origins of Christianity. That's the name of the book. And let me pull up the page numbers here. 1 second. Okay. It's from pages 148 to 149. So pages 148 and 149 in the book I just mentioned is where you'll find what I just read.
Wow. Thanks. I'm going to look into that.
Yeah, it's quite a fascinating theory he has. It's very interesting because it's like what he just said. It's kind of like a combination of elements from the Griesbach hypothesis and the 2-document hypothesis. It's like he's taking elements from those hypotheses that work. He omits the parts of it that don't work, and he creates this theory that eliminates at least most of the problems. At least if his theory is true, it would have done that.
Wow. Yeah, that's really a classic instance of how paradigms shift. You come up with a new one that sort of incorporates the old one, but solves its problems. Wow.
So what do you think about this? Do you think that Matthew and Luke did use, I think I may have already asked you this question on stream, but let me put it in another way for you. Do you think it's more likely Matthew and Luke didn't use the same version of Mark, or do you think they used 2 different versions of Mark? And in light of that, okay, actually, I remember I did ask you earlier this stream, but I'm going to add something to that question that I did not ask earlier. How many times do you think Mark was redacted? Is it, even if you don't really know for sure, what is the most likely number of times it's been changed?
I would start by counting up all of the Matthew-Luke agreements against Mark. And then you could kind of speculate on if there's any way to figure this out, what would be the average number of either goofs or intentional changes that a scribe would make. Like if we could be sure which of our manuscripts was directly descended from which others, we might be able to do that. That might be an approach to it. But I'm no textual critic, so probably Bart Ehrman or Gordon Fee would faint at the silliness of my suggestion.
Do you think the Gospel of Marcion was aware of Proto-Mark, or do you think the Gospel of Marcion is even earlier than Proto-Mark?
I don't know. There, I really have to keep thinking and sifting through, because I need to understand the differences between, is it Matthias Klinghardt? Is that his name?
Yes.
And on the other hand, Jason Bedune and Marcus Vincent. I'm sort of juggling bits of all of that stuff. Though I only know about Klinghardt in the vaguest form. I don't have a copy of that book, so. But I need to weigh those arguments, because, it seems to me there's got to be quite a difference in between two theories, one of which posits that Mark was the basis of Marcion's gospel, and another that says some version of Luke was. I need to understand how those differ and where they fit together, and how they're both dealing with the same sort of evidence and problems. So I'm really a novice in this.
Well, right now we don't have any more super chats, and I think we discussed pretty much enough of it for the moment. But yeah, this was a great discussion. I have no doubt that Proto-Mark is going to be a major discussion, a major topic to be discussed in the future of this channel.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
I've been digging really deep into the ground on the synoptic problem lately. I've had many scholars on the show with different views on how to solve it. And it's really been a fascinating discussion.
Wow, I wish I were more conversant with this stuff, but I hope I will be eventually.
Actually, I think you do quite a good job. But I want to take a moment to thank everybody that super chatted their questions on the live stream today. And Dr. Price, thanks for coming on. We'll see you later.
My pleasure. Thank you. See you soon.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.